Let me just quickly say that, as Dr. Haggis alluded to, I have an NGO background. 2 years ago, I would have come to you talking from that perspective, but I'm now here representing the perspective of the U.S. government, and specifically USAID, which I think, having had experience in both, I'm in trying to put this together, I was really impressed with how intertwined those are. You can't talk about NGOs without speaking of the funders that they come from, and quite frankly, you can't talk about USAID without talking about NGOs. So for a lot of what I say, I think I'm going to do a little bit of meshing, and we can get into where they're not the same maybe at the end. But for the purpose of what is relevant to you, I think you started answering these questions. What can we do? And where are we just going to drive you nuts? And where are we going to push back? So I think the first thing to note is that the U.S. government and the U.S. people as taxpayers are, if not the largest, one of the largest supporters of NGOs internationally. And they work on, as you mentioned, the sort of full range of assistance programs, from development, humanitarian aid, to what my office does, which is transition initiatives. I'm probably going to spend a little bit more time on that because I think he covered some of these other pieces really well. I want to start a little bit intertwining these already with what the goals of USAID are, because I think it's helpful in knowing where we stand and what we think we need to work on and where we want to go. We have an administrator, Rajiv Shah, who comes out of the Gates Foundation, one of the foundations that was mentioned that is in fact not scrambling for dollars, unlike the rest of us. And he's an incredibly ambitious person, and he's putting his ambition into our agency. And I can talk about some of the things that the agency's gone through over the past 10 years, or the past 20 years in some of the question and answer if you have questions about that. But what we're working on right now is a pretty ambitious program called USAID Forward. It's an inspirational title that has a lot behind it. The parts that I want to highlight are a couple. One of them is procurement reform, which sounds about as boring as anything that I could have brought up. But it turns out it's the guts. It's the guts of whether or not any of this works. And I think anybody in the military would know that. That if you don't have the right support, then you can't get the mission done. So in 1990, let me start back a little bit before that. The Berlin Wall falls, and there's a lot going on in Eastern Europe that piques the interest of our foreign policy. It's not just about aid, it's about the interests of our country and the dynamics of the world. And we have people who are in USAID who realize that the systems, the mechanisms that are in place are built for long-term development. So that's great if you want to sort of over the next 5 years to 25 years build up crops, build up large-scale infrastructure. But if what you're trying to do is work with nascent governments in Eastern Europe who are trying very, very hard not to implode, then telling them that, guess what, in 3 budget cycles, we are totally going to be able to respond to this need, it just doesn't cut it. And it is painful to any of us who have been out in the field and trying to respond. I mean, that level of flexibility is something that I've never experienced, because I've always been working, for one, post that period, but also working on the NGO side. I've not been on the budget cycle until very recently, but I just last week put in an argument for 2013. My office also last week went into Libya. So do we say in Libya, don't worry, because in 2013 we're all over it. It's just not enough, right? So in this period when we had what I consider to be a sort of great moment in the generation, in the history of our country and of our world, when the Berlin Wall falls, the fall of the USSR, and the transition in the way that there is a bipolar political spectrum that then becomes a very different world. That happens, USAID determines it needs to respond. One of the things that it does is to start building up even further what is now called, what is now the bureau that I'm in, for for democracy, conflict, and humanitarian assistance. I shouldn't have looked up, and then people know you don't pay attention to your acronyms. But the Dacha Bureau, where I work, is made up of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which was one of the mentioned here, working significantly right now, for example, in the Horn of Africa. And the Office of Transition Initiatives, where I work, we also have the Office of Military Affairs that does a lot of liaison with youth. For fairly obvious reasons, and that goes back to what I said to begin with, which is that we're charting new territory. And so my office, in addition to working in these post-conflict spaces, and one of our largest operations is in Afghanistan. Before that, it was in Iraq. We have two other major offices, one of them in Pakistan and the other in Haiti. Of our major offices, almost all of them involve the military significantly. Haiti also involved the military significantly, but not for the long period of time, and not in the same way as I would argue as our Afghanistan. So, yes, I will skip all of those things. So, we create this office, the Office of Transition Initiatives, where I work. And what it's supposed to do, and what I think it does fairly well actually, is recognize that we can't operate on a development timeline in these transition spaces. So whereas the normal cycle is prone for example, for hiring, might take a year to hire somebody, the Office of Transition Initiatives, and not us alone, but we are one of the offices that does this significantly, can hire people on sort of maybe 2 weeks is about the amount of time that it would take. But it means that we have contracting mechanisms where we can expand and we can contract fairly fast. We also do the same for our programs. In Haiti, within 24 hours, we had people on the ground after the earthquake, and within 48 hours, we started a program. So that is the kind of flexibility that you need to be able to have in these transition spaces. And that's where I would say that we have made significant efforts. We're now 16 years old. So within the last 16 years, we've done a lot to be able to change the way that USAID can respond in these places. I think Libya is an interesting example here of a place that we've gone into in a fairly rapid amount of time. In the last 4 weeks, what it is that we think that we are going to do, what we are trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish has changed probably 3 different times over. Initially it was working with civilians alone. Now we're looking at what support we can give to the transitional authorities. And it will change 3 times over again in the next 3 weeks following this. So we set short-term goals, and our offices have a really intensive management structure where we decide what the big goal is, but that is sort of, our big goal almost everywhere is a transition to a stable and democratic peace where everyone has a voice and there's a lot of group hugging and we're all very happy. Within that, there's a subset, there are many subsets, and that for us changes. We try not to set out a goal beyond 6 months. And every 3 months we have a revisitation, not just of are we accomplishing what we say we're gonna do, but is what we say we're gonna do actually going to get us towards that larger goal? So we look for symbolic things, we look for catalytic things, we pay attention to perceptions. Another thing that's important about the way that our office works is we recognize that the people that may be the catalysts may not be the people who have existed for the last 50 years in putting together really strong, auditable sort of processes. So in Tahrir Square in Egypt, for example, the people who were agents of change there were individuals. We give an example a lot of times of 3 women under a tree. If those 3 women under the tree say, we want to make significant change, and USAID goes to them and says, that is so great because we support that significant change. If you could just have 3 financial people hired and an international firm to do your auditing, that would be great. And we will give you this grant. That's not possible. So in Tahrir Square, for example, the person who says, you know what we want to do, we want to get together we've got 10 people, we're going to clean up the streets and show that we're making progress here. But what we'd like to do is have 500 people. And we'd like to give them t-shirts, and we'd like for this to be sort of a recognized movement. We'd like to move us forward in that. We can buy those t-shirts, give them to the group, and handle all the financial transactions within our own organization so that we're able to do that more rapidly. It's something that, quite frankly, the military has been doing a lot of as well. So, so the difference being that we are centered in the development space. We bring people with a development lens, and we are focused at. So there was a question of why is my office specifically, why isn't it in USAID when it could be somewhere else? And I would argue that what we do is build the building blocks for longer term development. And so we want to be in the space where we're going to start handing over to the thing that comes after us, which means that we have to be in USAID. If we're not in USAID, then our structures look different. It's hard enough to hand over from one person to another in an establishment, let alone from one entity in USAID to another, not just USAID, but any place. But harder still if you're in a different agency altogether. So I think it's critical that we are part of USAID, but we are doing a lot of the things that I think are also critical to the work that a lot of people in the military are doing. The sort of, I think, last thing that I want to highlight is, and this is just because I'm always hardest on the things that I love, and I do love the work that we do overseas, but I think that it has a lot of challenges associated with it. One of which is efficacy. When somebody says, how do you know? How do you know that you're making a difference? It's not an easy question to answer. We don't get to declare victory and go home. These processes are often, even if you're working in a short time frame, which we often are only working in 18 months to a 3-year program, it's very difficult to say, I would like to take responsibility for the fact that this country is now at peace. This program was so good that this country is now at peace. It's not just impossible, it's wildly inappropriate, because you are not, in fact, in charge of the politics of another country. So we have a difficulty in being able to say we know that we're doing a good job, but it's one thing that I think we're seized with. And one of the main focuses of USAID right now, the second part, I sort of jumped over this, but is metrics and measuring and being able to do monitoring and evaluation that doesn't speak to the number of pencils we produce, but the number of children that receive education, and even more than that, what does that roll up to? Does that roll up to peace and democracy? And for us, it's so much more the process rather than the outcome. So you can build a school in a town, and that school can only profit one ethnicity. And if that town is suffering from violence between two ethnicities, you've actually made it more difficult for them to come to a resolution. But if you go into the town and you say, we'll get you a school, but this guy and that guy in charge of the two ethnicities have to actually come together and have a certain percentage of workers from both sides, and we need to make sure that we need to see how we're going to have a plan for both ethnicities to be part of this school throughout the leadership and the student body. It doesn't matter that it was a school. It mattered that everybody came together to do it together. And for us, that's where our programming often comes into conflict with development specialists who are looking at the longer term time frame. Because their question is, why are you doing these programs? They have 3 schools, why would they need a 4th school? And our answer is because they wanted one. And they said they'd work together to build it. And since our goal is to make sure that these ethnicities come together, then we do want to have good development principles, and not least for our own goals, which is, if you build a school and they actually didn't need it, then you've shot yourself in the foot and you've walked yourself back. But if doing something catalytic is important for bringing people together, then we value that fairly highly in a transitional space. A second issue which is difficult for the NGO community, specifically in Africa, is the idea that NGOs are actually displacing the role of government. And I think it's something to be a little bit sensitive to. In our country, there are NGOs that participate in supporting the things that we do, United Way, and a whole host of others. But there's no question in our minds that United Way is not the place to go to get Medicare taken care of, right? There are massive programs that our government works on, and I think there's no question in our mind that who's the president of our country is more important than who's the president of any NGO, or even who's in charge of the United Nations. That's not the case in certain places where there's actually a challenge in the financial resources. Sao Tome and Principe, for example, has 75, when you're doing when you're measuring aid as a percentage of GDP, 75% of GDP in Sao Tome and Principe is aid. The top 6 countries are all in Africa when you're measuring that statistic, and most of the top 50 are in Africa. So if you're working in security issues in Africa, it's important to be sensitive to the way that you can actually be destabilizing by undermining the legitimacy of the government as the place for people to go to get resources taken care of. And within the aid community, I think that is something that we're aware of. It's a tough balance because you can't give authority without the government being able to respond. You can't just say, the government will now handle all things education, and then they have no teachers. You've now, again, undermined yourself and the government. So it's not an easy balance, and getting it wrong, I don't think, is for lack of thinking about it. It's because this is not easy to balance. The final one, which you actually mentioned, is this coordination piece. I've talked a lot about NGOs and USAID assistance as if they are very similar, which I think they are. But in one important way they are not, which is that NGOs do not have any domestic constituency that is made up of anyone who doesn't want to be part of that NGO. So you can have a board, but that board chose to be there. You can have donors, but those donors have given of their own interest in the issue that NGO is created for. So it is, I think, both the greatest strength and the most difficult thing about working with NGOs is that they are able to, in many ways, they're able to pull out ahead of us on the issues that we would wish that we would focus on and wish we would move towards. And I'm so grateful that there are NGOs that are sort of these just so far out ahead of where an entity that has a huge domestic constituency that it needs to respond to all of those needs. I'm so glad that there's somebody out there who's not thinking about that, who can say, focused with laser focus on the issue of the child with the large belly and the big eyes, this is what I think we need to do. Because that can actually be an anchor, and it can walk us all in the sort of right direction. But it makes coordination unbelievably difficult, because it's actually not important to the food NGO that the advocacy NGO have their issue taken care of. So how do you bring all of those folks together under the same tent? And here is where I think donors have played a significant role. One of the sort of, I think, undeniable truths of the world is that you can follow the money. And so while there are, 3,700 and 3,700 NGOs on the continent of Africa, there are not that many sources of large amounts of money. So if you can get the sources of money to coordinate and say, look, you do education, I'll work on the water system here, or you do education in this part of the country and I'll do education down here, but let's not everybody do the same thing, then you can avoid some of that repetition, and you can have a certain strategy behind some of the disorganization or the competing interests. The other thing that I think NGOs is that NGOs recognize that themselves, and what you mentioned about interaction. It's an amazing development. It's one of those things where people think that nations will never form. The United States will never get past its sort of states' rights because everybody wants to have their own little piece of the pie. Well, Interaction is an organization where you watch these NGOs with their own missions come together to have one voice, recognizing that that power of that one voice and is more important than being able to only contribute to their own mission. And they implement approximately $13 billion a year by their own count. So they're not small change in that sense, at least not in the civilian world. So you see people seized with these issues, and you see people trying to work on these issues. But I do think that there's still a lot that we need to do to close the gap between specifically conflict and peace in those transition areas.